Hello, and welcome to Lesson 1-1, The Human Brain. This lesson will focus primarily on the structure and function of the various components of our brain. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The brain is the centerpiece of the central nervous system. So all voluntary and involuntary motion occurs and is controlled by the brain. All thinking occurs in the brain. All of our life support systems, so our breathing, our digestive processes, all occur within the brain. The exception of life support that does not occur primarily in the brain is the function of our heart and our reflexes. There are three major areas of our brain. So let's go ahead and dive into these in a little bit more depth. We have the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is all of this little spongy material right here. Okay, so that is our cerebrum. Right in there, all this gray, bluish material there, all that wrinkly part. Okay, that is our cerebrum. Then we have the cerebellum, which this particular picture doesn't get into too great a detail, but in other pictures and in real life, it actually looks a lot more like a tree. This will be the branches of the tree, and it'll kind of spiral into a trunk. The cerebellum itself then also extends into this middle part here. Okay, so this whole component is a portion of the cerebellum. And this is a little bit beyond what we need to know for our class in here, but this component here is considered to be the limbic system. And we'll talk a little bit about this, but not too much. So just realize that the blue-gray spongy component out here is the cerebrum, and then this green part and this part in here is considered to be the cerebellum. And finally, last but not least, we have the brainstem. And the brainstem is going to happen in this component. So this is the spinal cord coming up this direction. So you have all of your nerves that go throughout your body will feed up through your spinal cord. It'll enter into the brainstem, which really is made up of a few different components. It's made up of the midbrain, pons, and the medulla. So these are the three components of the brainstem. And these guys really control our basic life functions. So primarily our breathing and our digestion all occur within this brainstem. So that's the three major components of the human brain. You have the basic life support, which is your brainstem. You have the cerebellum, which controls a lot of memory and balance. And then you have the cerebrum, which is the blue-gray spongy part. And that's where a lot of our thinking, a lot of our senses come into play. And that is the cerebrum. Okay, so those are the three main components of our brain, or sections of our brain: cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. Now, for those of you that are going to be reading Adoration of Jenna Fox later this year, you will become very familiar with the term butterfly of the brain. Now, in the book, they talk about a component of the brain, and it actually is not that they call it the butterfly of the brain, but that's actually not the correct body part. The correct portion of the brain that is considered to be the butterfly is our cerebellum. And if you look at a scan of our brain, top side down, you will see this little shape kind of like a butterfly. And that is a component of the cerebellum. For instance, you can see this little Bluetooth looking thing here, a thing that kind of would go around the ear or whatever. That is what we're looking for on the top view. So this is the top view, that's the side view. This part right here. Okay, so that is what is considered to be the butterfly of the brain. Now, what does the cerebellum do? The cerebellum controls all motor functions, okay, our posture, and our balance. So if something goes haywire in our cerebellum, we're not going to have very good balance. Our posture is going to be very off-kiltered, and we're going to have very poor motor control. So motor control can be anything from raising your arm all the way down to making your tongue work with your upper mouth to create syllables. Okay, so if you have problems with enunciation, you could have an issue with your cerebellum and the motor control function of that. And again, the brainstem, which is this component right here, the brainstem controls all basic life functions. Okay, so that is the two major components of what the cerebellum does and what our brainstem does. Now getting into our cerebrum, and again, that's the spongy component of our brain. These are broken up into several lobes. We have the frontal lobe, and that's this guy right here in the front, which makes sense. So frontal lobe is in the front of our brain, right by our forehead, and it controls our logic and thinking. This is where our reasoning takes place. This is where we make decisions between right and wrong. And when someone says, think before you act, that's the component of the brain they're asking you to use. Now, in your defense, this component of the brain does not become fully developed till around the decade of 20 to 30 years of age. So your brain, right now, is still developing. It's still maturing, and this component, the component of reasoning and thinking and being able to make the right choice and think about our actions before we do them, is still under development. So when your parents say, think before you act, say, yes, I absolutely will do that, but say, in my defense, my frontal lobe is still developing. Okay, so you do have a little bit of biology on your side there. Next, we'll go ahead into our temporal lobe. So this is the blue-gray portion in this picture. And the temporal lobe is responsible for memory, for speech, for hearing, and this will work a lot with our limbic system, which again is that component of the cerebellum. And that's where a lot of our learning takes place, hence the memory component, so long-term and short-term memory. And then next we have occipital lobe, so that's right here in the back, and believe it or not, even though it's the furthest component of the brain away from the eyeballs, it is responsible for our visual processing. So our eyes are here. Here's our eyeballs. And we have nerves running out the back of our eyeballs, and they connect to our occipital lobe, and whatever we perceive here connects into our occipital lobe. Okay, so this is where the visual processing center of our brain is. And the eyeballs are relatively the same size as they were when you were born. They do grow a little bit, but not a ton. The eyes are actually a component of the brain. So remember, even though the eyes are in the front of our heads, they're controlled by the back of our brains, the occipital lobe. Then we have the parietal lobe, and that's this guy in yellow right up here. And he controls our movements and our responses to stimuli. So if you ever got a needle or a shot in your life, which I'm sure we all have, whenever that needle enters your brain, the nerve endings in your skin fire signals saying, ow. And those signals travel up your spinal cord, and they go into your parietal lobe, where it tells you, ow. So for some folks, they don't get that response. Like somebody gets pricked in their finger and the nerve cells don't work, whether it's a problem with the nerve endings in the finger or something happens with the transmission going all the way up the spinal cord and the parietal lobe doesn't get that information to tell the rest of us, ow. Okay, so that is your parietal lobe. And finally, we're going to end with this little strip here of red in between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. That is called our motor cortex. So this is where it's a very specialized area of senses, but this is where most of our motor control happens. So if I want to raise my arm above my head, it's controlled by this portion of the brain. If I want to say something to you, it's controlled by this portion of the brain, because this portion will tell my tongue within hundredths of a second what shape it needs to make sure that I produce an audible and understandable word. Okay? So in quick review, frontal lobe, so the front of my brain, controls thinking and reasoning. Temporal lobe controls memory, speech, and hearing. My occipital lobe is vision. Parietal lobe is movement and response to stimuli. And my motor cortex controls how I move. Okay, so that is a nutshell of your cerebrum. And again, you'll be able to see this is the outside of the brain. And if I were to cut a brain in half and take half of it away, so this outside spongy material away, this is what the inside of the brain looks like. And you can see here in the cerebellum where I said it kind of looks like a tree, this picture does a much better job showing the details of the branches of the cerebellum. Okay? And I will point out one structure in this picture called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is this material right here. Okay? And what it does is it's a material that links our right hemisphere of our brain and our left hemisphere of our brain and allows signals to transfer back and forth between the two hemispheres. Okay? So the cells of the brain. So what are each individual small tiny cells? What are those called? Those are called neurons. Okay, so the cells of the brain are called neurons, and they look like this. Okay, they also look like this when they've got dye running through them or when they're looking at a specific picture. All right, so here is the cell of our brain, and we have these things called dendrites, which are the receiving end of impulses, and we have this axon, which is a long narrow tubule, and we have these axon terminals, and this is where the signals or the impulses leave the nerve cell. And if you've ever seen an animation of a nerve cell, you may see little lightning bolts going from the axon onto a dendrite. So on the other side of this, we have little receptors. I'll just draw a couple of them, and they lead into another nerve cell. Sorry, I'm not the greatest of artists. Okay, so these components are our dendrites. So, and then it travels on down, and it ends leaving our axons. Okay, the impulses of our body always travel the same direction. They travel going from the dendrites through the cell and down the axons into another dendrite. Okay, so what direction do impulses travel? Dendrite to axon. Okay, and you can see that this is an actual human brain, and it was cut in half, and we can see there's different colors of material here. You see the white component and you see the gray component. So the outer portion of our brains are considered to be gray matter, and the inner portion of our brain is considered to be white matter. Okay, so what is the difference between white matter and gray matter? Well, for a long, long time, scientists believed that the gray matter is where everything happened, and they didn't really know what the white matter was because they didn't know how to test it. Well, as technology advanced and as different scientific studies went into place, they were able to test what happens in white matter. And they found out that a heck of a lot actually does happen in this white matter. So they wanted to look and they wanted to figure out what makes this part of the brain white and what makes this part of the brain gray. Well, they figured out that synapses and impulses travel much faster in the white component of the brain than they do of the gray component. And the reason being is if this were a cell in the brain, it would more than likely occur in the gray matter. Okay? And the reason I can say that is it's missing myelin. Okay? Myelin is, they just look like little rectangles on the axon. They have little gaps in them. Okay, so let's say those are myelin. And when you have myelin, which is spelled M-Y-E-L-I-N, myelin, when you have an impulse coming in the dendrite and they have these myelin, think of them as little hopscotches. Okay, so remember the game hopscotch, 1, 2, 3, and wherever the stone is, you got to skip it. So an impulse comes in and they go, oh, there's a stone in 1, I'm going to skip you. There's a stone in 2, I'm going to skip you. There's no stone here, I'm going to go through you, and now I'm going to get out of the cell. Okay? Because of this skipping, the impulses are able to travel along the axon much, much faster. And that is, and myelin just happens to be a white substance. So when you see all of this area that is white, that means the axons have myelin in them. So white matter equals myelin, or myelin equals white matter. And the gray matter is missing this myelin. So impulses still travel along the axon, but because they're missing these, it just has to go the long way around. Okay, so they just go a little bit slower. Now, I will mention that in the gray matter, there is a few cells in here that do contain myelin, but for our purposes, myelin equals white matter, no myelin equals gray matter. Okay? And here is a picture of the evolution of the brain. The first brain, or what we would call a brain, consists in mollusks. And mollusks are your octopi, squid, and then on land we have snails, and slugs. Okay, that's what mollusks are. And that is where we have the first brain. So you may have heard in your travels that the octopus is the smartest invertebrate on the planet. And it can be the smartest invertebrate on the planet, meaning no backbone, because it has a brain. Okay? As far as a thinking brain goes, though, we believe currently that the first hints of thinking occur in fish. Okay? And one of the key distinctions required for a thinking brain is having a backbone or vertebrates. Okay? And we think it's vitally important that to think you must be a vertebrate is because the vertebrate has a backbone which helps protect, let's say that's a really crude backbone, all of the nerve cells that goes up and down our body. Okay? So that is an importance of the backbone. Let's take a real quick look, if we can, at all of the evolution of the brain. And there's a lot of different components of the brain. There's the olfactory lobe for smelling. There's the cerebrum for thinking. Okay, keep an eye on that one. There's the optic lobe, the cerebellum, the medulla, and the spinal cord. All right, and you can see as we go up the evolutionary trail here, bony fish to amphibian, to reptile, to bird, and to mammal, we get a much larger thinking component of the brain because our thinking occurs in the cerebrum, right? Remember that from a few slides ago. The cerebrum is where all of our thinking, our logic, our memories, all the learning occurs in the cerebrum. So the bigger your cerebrum is, the more intelligent you are. Okay? So bony fish have a little bit, amphibians a little bit bigger, reptiles is a little bit bigger still, followed by birds, and then mammals. Okay? Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor is a neuroanatomist at Harvard University, and she is a brilliant neuroanatomist. And what makes her awesome is that, and a little unlucky, is that she was studying strokes and what happens to people when a stroke occurs, and lo and behold, she actually had one. And she stayed conscious long enough to realize and to experience and be able to remember exactly what happens during a stroke. And because of that, we now know so much more about strokes than we did before. So Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor is our Geek of the Week. And speaking of stroke, we have a couple of slides on different brain diseases, and two ways a stroke can occur are either a burst blood vessel or a clogged vessel. So a burst vessel, what happens here is your blood vessels here, and then the lining of this blood vessel gets so weak from wear and tear and from clotting and unclotting and the breakage of the wall here of the blood vessel itself. It gets so thin that it pops, just like a balloon does. Okay? When you blow up a balloon, the bigger the balloon gets, the thinner the plastic wall is of the balloon until the tension is so great on that plastic it breaks. Same thing can occur with a blood vessel. Okay, so a burst blood vessel can cause a stroke. Another and much more common way of receiving a stroke is getting a blood clot. And what happens here is over time we get blockage in this blood vessel because this blood vessel is just like every other blood vessel in our body. Blood flows through it, fatty deposits, cholesterol, all kinds of stuff can cake on the side here, and over time it can block and narrow the passageway. And if a certain type of blood clot occurs, which are called platelets, if that occurs on a wall and that gets dislodged, it's just like if a scab, you ever skin your knee and then the scab gets really rough? Well, that rough portion can clog an entire artery here or blood vessel, and then a clot forms, and then we have a problem with a stroke, okay? Or that's what can cause a stroke. Now, what is a stroke? A stroke is an actual attack in our brain. So we have heart attacks, and that happens with our cardiovascular system. But this is our cerebrovascular system, and we can have what's called a brain attack. And what happens is is the blood clot blocks an artery, which is a blood vessel that carries blood from the heart to our body, or in this case, up to our brain, or the blood vessel, which is a tube through which the blood moves through the body, breaks, which is the burst vessel, interrupting blood flow to an area of the brain. So whenever one of these happens, we have an interruption of blood flow to our brain. When either happens, our brain cells begin to die because we don't have enough blood flow to that area. When brain cells die during a stroke, the abilities controlled by that area of the brain are lost. These abilities can include speech, movement, and memory. Okay? So how a stroke patient is affected depends on where the stroke occurs in the brain and how much of the brain is damaged. Okay? Because when you lose blood flow to a brain, those cells die and they do not come back. All right? So that is an issue with the stroke, or what an actual stroke is. And our last disease that we will talk about today that can occur in the brain is cerebral palsy. It is congenital, which means it's permanent. There is no cure for it right now. Damage occurs to the brain at or near birth. It can go up to as soon as the birth happens, and it usually occurs in the white matter of the brain. And it can be caused by an infection in the mom or the baby just prior to birth, lack of oxygen to the brain, or bleeding during birth. Okay? And cerebral palsy is actually an umbrella term that refers to a group of disorders affecting a person's ability to move. Cerebral palsy affects people in different ways, and it can affect body movement, your muscle control, your muscle coordination, your muscle tone, reflexes, posture, and balance. So if I were to say I have cerebral palsy, that in my balance is messed up, my posture is messed up, that's probably talking about my cerebellum. Because remember, your cerebellum controls all of those functions. Okay, your posture, your balance, your reflexes, all can come from your cerebellum. Okay?